provocateur.media.
I so love being older. I look, I see a tall, cool drink of water, and I go through my mind all the awesome things I could do.
And then you take a nap.
And then I take a nap. I love it.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome to the Goldwaters, an extra spicy edition of the podcast. Anne France, Dr. Samantha, and Daniel are here to comment about current events, drawing on both their professional experience and the trademark Goldwater wit, of course. And today's episode is all about monogamy. Today we have a very special guest on the podcast. We're joined by Dr. Laurie Betito. She's a speaker, radio host, psychologist, and sex therapist, and the author of The Sex Bible for People Over 50, The Complete Guide to Sexual Love for Mature Couples. You can hear her weeknights on CJAD 800 radio in Montreal, and on News Talk 1010 Toronto on the Passion program, where this moderator got his start in radio, actually. And Dr. Laurie, welcome to the Goldwaters.
Thank you so much. Great being here.
Thanks, Laurie. It's great having you here.
Now, I want to start this off as the old person at the table, especially because I grew up, from a sexual perspective, in the 70s, being involved with a lot of people who had grown up in the 60s, because as you know, young women tend to hang out with men who are somewhat older. And ostensibly, it was the era of free love and sexual experimentation. And I thought that there was a lot of nonsense and bogus approaches that went contrary to how human nature really works. So I'm kind of surprised that now, about 35 years later, we seem to be having the same discussions that were had then. How come?
It is interesting, actually, to see the wave and the change. And I think there's just so many more discussions about sexuality in general and looking at the range. When you look at sexual orientation, 35 years ago, you were either straight or gay, if you ever came out with it anyway. There was no in between, so everything was black and white. Same with all sexual expression, like people who were into kinky stuff or BDSM or anything like that. That was definitely not talked about. It was taboo, and it was looked at as something sick. Well, fast forward 35 years, and you have a completely different approach to it. It's mainstream. We know that there is now, we all fall on a spectrum of sexual identity, sexual orientation, sexual preferences, and I think this is all part of this wave. And same with monogamy. We fall on a spectrum of what's good for us, and we're more able to talk about what's good for us. So the society we live in now, I think, has just opened up a little more because we can talk about it a whole lot more.
Well, where I would challenge you is there's a difference between the reality, because I really don't think the realities of human sexual and romantic behavior have changed. I think, indeed, what might be changing is how we talk about things, how openly we talk about things. And I think that part of the effect of that is to hypersexualize a lot of social intercourse, because it becomes almost mandatory that you talk about all the ambiguities of your romantic feelings and your sexual feelings and your orientation and what your sex is even. You're not even allowed just to be a man or a woman. You have to be some type, that's just some artificial social construct. We shouldn't be limited by that. We should happily experiment and experiment with every facet of identity and being. And I get it, for a lot of people who aren't comfortable with the classic social paradigms. I'm one of them. I have a certain opinion about why women are expected to have feminine behavior, and I've bristled against that my entire life. But on the other hand, I wonder at the extent to which there's, as I say, I don't want to call it too much freedom, because freedom is always a positive word, but I wonder to what extent it puts a pressure on people to engage and indulge in behaviors that are, in fact, in my opinion, very destructive, like non-monogamy.
Well, but you just contradicted yourself. You just said that historically that you don't think that sexuality in terms of behavior has changed at all. But now with increasing dialogue about it, now it's changing sexual behavior, and that's a bad thing. Is that the argument?
it's putting a pressure. It's not necessarily changing behavior. I agree with you. There may be a contradiction in what I'm saying. Lord knows, I've never pretended to have a perfectly coherent opinions from one minute to the next. But the point is, it creates a pressure. You are suddenly a boring person. If you grow up and you complete your education and you marry and you have a couple of children and a dog and a house and a car, you're viewed as engaging in this, heteronormative behavior.
But that's all or nothing. Expression. That's like all or nothing thinking, though. It's like, it's just allowing other people who might not have fit in that. There's plenty of people who still choose monogamy and still choose whatever else that's always been around, but it gives the freedom for others to express that without shame and guilt and all of the taboo surrounding it. So it's not like suddenly there's all this pressure to not be monogamous or pressure to experiment. I just think it allows people to experiment. Those are the people who would not have in the past because of fear of reprisal or fear of being shamed or what have you.
But in the world 2017, we still can't parse consent. So I have a huge concern about the number of ever younger teenagers who engage in sexual activity because there's a social expectation, all this dialogue. And if you look at the number of people who assert that they've been sexually assaulted, not just women after all, men as well.
1 in 3.
Well, there you go. What that says to me is that in giving a certain freedom to indulge in sexual behaviors outside of marriage, oh my God, I sound like a nun.
Dr. Schlesinger, thank you.
Call me Phyllis Schlafly.
In terms of, you're talking about young people and sexuality, the age at first sexual intercourse has not changed in 60 years. So,
really? What is
that's
it?
right. It's 16.4 years of age, and it has not changed in generations. So we have this thinking that, everybody is doing everything, like it's such a free love and everybody's confused and anything goes. But time hasn't changed that much. Like sexuality and youth and what have you hasn't really changed all that much. We've always had sexuality and sexual curiosity and et cetera.
We have, and I don't see how being willing to have more flexible thinking in terms of what works for us in terms of relationships and in terms of sexuality. I don't see how that, and particularly because the conversations ends up being about consensual interest. It ends up being, I am interested in BDSM. I feel more comfortable being willing to admit that, or I'm okay admitting that I'd like to seek a partner outside of marriage or be poly. I don't see what the relationship to that is with sexual violence. And in fact, if you're going to say that type of dialogue increased sexual violence, it just isn't the case. It's only been about, 30 years ago that in Canada that it was still fine to rape your wife, that wasn't considered a crime. I think what that changed in, was it 83 or 86, that actually became a criminal act that you could actually sexually assault your married partner. So again, I don't see how the relationship with sexual assault and with consent issues, where I do think you do make one point that's extremely important, and that in fact I do think some of the recent discussions about the recent acceptance of increasing acceptance of non-monogamy and of other types of non-heteronormative sexual intercourse and relationships, is that there's been much more emphasis on having open discussions with your partner about what works for you sexually. So if anything, that's contributing to more of an ethos of consent in the relationship, that we shouldn't just default on monogamy and this is how it's supposed to work, but that it may behoove us to have these real open discussions with our partners within the first few months of dating.
Also, I just want to point out, it's on this conversational point, this dialogue, yeah, I think conversation is where all good things begin. And as I actually mentioned, I teased Dr. Laurie, but when we came in, conversation, if you look at the etymology of the word, actually relates to sexuality. And I think Canterbury Tales, if you go way back, to converse with someone and to know someone is related to sexuality in a good way.
That was good porn. in the day. That was the soft
Lady Chatterley's lover too.
Oh my
right?
goodness.
Yeah, a little too chick flick for me. I was more of a Marquis de Sade.
Although as a side note, when we're getting into the intersection between consent, sexual assault, and more sexual liberation, Lady Chatterley's Lover, there was a glorification of sexual assault in the book, which was deeply disturbing when I was reading it.
Well,
back
read
in
Marquis
the day,
de Sade and get really
Well, I
disturbed.
was gonna
that's a whole
say-
different category. Yes, touche.
So let's dig into monogamy, shall we? So first of all, does it really work in practice or only on paper? This is a pretty hot topic lately. Scarlett Johansson was in the news recently, coming out because she doesn't believe that monogamy is, quote, natural. Is monogamy natural, or is polyamory natural?
You're asking a really big question, because monogamy is a social construct, and monogamy is choice, whether it's natural, unnatural. Some people fit really nicely with monogamy and others don't. And I think that because it's a social construct, you end up with a lot of infidelity and cheating and what have you for people who where monogamy is not comfortable for them, but they want to get married anyway, and so they find some other way, and unfortunately it causes betrayal and pain and what have you. So we can naturally make choices, but for some people it doesn't fit for them. The open relationship, polyamorous, swinging, whatever it is much more fitting to their lifestyle. And that's fine as long as you are with someone who also believes the same thing. And if you have two people who you decide the terms of your relationship, otherwise it's infidelity. Point final. Like if you don't have that discussion with somebody about the terms of your relationship, whether you want to be monogamish, which is like monogamy with a little extra on the side, but at least it's discussed. Or whether you have an open marriage, or whether you have, decide that together you want to be a swinging couple. There's rules, always rules, and more rules, because there's a lot of discussion around what that means.
Well, and therein is the opportunity, as far as I'm concerned, for oppression of the partner. So I'll tell you one thing. If there's one thing I learned vividly from my matrimonial practice, despite the statistics that have been thrown at us from generation to generation, I have to tell you, the notion that one sex or another has a greater sexual appetite or a greater inclination for adultery is nonsense. I have met, I'm sure, probably exactly 50-50.
Yeah, but statistically, it's still more men that cheat. And statistically, if we look at sexual desire, it doesn't mean that men don't have low sexual desire. But when there's a desire discrepancy, it's usually because the male, at least in hetero relationships, it's the male who has more.
Except we're talking about the concept of adultery, where desire and drive don't necessarily have anything to do with anything. If a man has stopped or has satisfying his wife or never has, whatever her drive is, she's likely to look elsewhere.
No, a woman looks for relationships outside of marriage, at least according to studies, not for the sex. For the attention.
Here.
Right.
For the attention,
Right.
the validation,
That's
the
right.
self-esteem.
Although again, individual results may vary.
Just so. But my point is, when by the time they come to me, where there has been the extramarital relationship, the common thread I find is the deception, the emotional harm, and that's
right.
Men and women are equally cruel to each other.
Yes.
And I've had as many men cry in my arms because their wife has gone elsewhere, even if it's, as they say, an accident on a business trip far away in Hong Kong. Or it's been a steady lover. I don't find there's a difference between the sexes in terms of the suffering it engenders.
Absolutely not.
I live in a world where I see the suffering and harm that are engendered by adultery.
But this is sure. We're talking about reasons to cheat or not cheat. It depends on the rules of the game, and we're talking about gender imbalances, and that's all well and good. But what's more important? The only question I have to this communication point. Obviously, communication is what the starting point should be. But again, as a family law practitioner, there's also a question about who can negotiate better. There's always going to be an upper hand in a negotiation between partners. There's always one partner that will have a power imbalance, whether it comes down to who desires it more, who is cleverer than the next person, and who has the real desire to initiate the conversation, then one partner can start kowtowing to the other for the sake of security, for the sake of not losing something.
And once there are children in a relationship, then you can no longer change the rules of the game.
Which is
That's
why
not fair.
Which is why the way I operate is, look, monogamy is the presumption, because it sort of flattens the power imbalance, I like to think. And then from there we can start negotiating, but buyer beware. When you're negotiating with your partner, who initiates this conversation? You got to ask yourself.
Well, you bring up a good point, Daniel, because I've had, as a marriage counselor and somebody who's worked with a lot of couples where infidelity was part of it, and we talk about renegotiating the terms of a relationship. Like that's, the person who initiates, who might say, hey, I want an open relationship now. The other partner, who may not have at all thought about this, now is thrown into insecurity about why am I not enough? What do you want? Are you cheating? Are you not? So the lines of communication, I mean, it's have to be very open, and you have to have a lot of compassion for your partner and a lot of listening without, because it's so emotionally laden, right? When you talk about this kind of stuff.
And frankly, I think that even when you're getting into monogamy, because Daniel, you're presenting monogamy as being the great equalizer, this sort of as a default assumption, and that, if you're going into this default monogamous relationship, then it doesn't necessitate this excellent communication, and it sort of levels off some of the power imbalances. But that assumes that we even know what monogamy is when we're talking. Mm-hmm. And monogamy varies considerably based on the couple. I have even close girlfriends, some of whom see monogamy as being, if my partner looks at pornography, then he's cheating on me.
Right.
Or if my partner checks out another girl, then he's cheating on me.
Right.
Or guys will say, well, if you have a female or something, I've had some male friends, well, if she has a male friend, then she's cheating on me if she's going out to a movie with him or spending time together that's not with me. So I think that even when we're going into a default monogamous relationship, it still behooves us to have really open discussions about what exactly that means. And I don't think it necessarily levels things out.
Right. Every couple has their boundaries, and that's really important, which is why you have to talk about it. I may be perfectly comfortable with my husband being flirty with other women because I don't feel that it's a threat to my marriage, whereas somebody else might say, oh, gee, no, can't even talk to, I'm not comfortable if you talk to an ex or talk to another woman or what have you.
Or carpool with your female coworker to work.
Yeah. And the issue of pornography too, the feeling that, like I've had clients who felt that if their partner masturbated, it meant that they were somehow depriving them of something, or that they were cheating with their own right hand, so these things come into play.
Well, I agree with everything that's being said. Yes, it's a spectrum. But you're on that spectrum. I don't want to use a word that's a little loaded in sort of religious dialogue, but there's sexual deviation. If you're deviating your sexual energies, your intimate energies from your life partner, you're on that spectrum. So whether it starts with masturbation or something even softer, say, the Jimmy Carter sinning in my heart, lusting in my heart after someone else, you're beginning on the spectrum. So I'm supporting your point, Samantha, and I think I'm also supporting your point, Laurie, that there is this spectrum. It needs to be defined. But before that discussion even happens, just to make my point, let's just have a very sort of vanilla default presumption that kissing someone else, making love to someone else, I think most people agree upon.
So that has to be physical contact with each other's sexual kibbles and bits, then that's what...
No.
Well, what is it, below the belt, above the neck? Like,
You're lawyering, guys. You guys are lawyering.
We're not even lawyers. Psychologists.
That's my point. But everyone has a lawyer and everyone has a psychologist in them. And you guys are bringing out the lawyer on this point. There's a principle, and you guys are trying to throw it through the salami slicer before there's a case study or case example.
Whoa, salami slicer is an awesome metaphor in the context of this conversation.
Yeah,
look, when two people get married, sign that marriage contract, there is that, what you say, Daniel, that it's monogamy. Like, that's what you signed on for, is monogamy, unless otherwise specified.
But I want to tell you, in Quebec in particular, and it was a huge fight that existed between me and the French-Canadian lawyers in my office, they said you cannot walk into a courtroom in France and argue that people who are in common law relationships have not made the promise of fidelity and monogamy just because they didn't get married. Common law couples in Quebec are in their minds just as bound to each other as married couples. They just don't want the economic consequences, which is very fascinating. And that my friends, is how I discovered that the promise of all this playing around with one's kibble and bits is a huge mistake and means the end of your primary relationship.
Except no.
Except no, because if the sex is no good, you don't bother anyway.
No.
And if the sex is good, it starts taking you away emotionally from your relationship.
How many people, how many swingers, how many people in the swinging community have you spoken to? How many? I can tell you that, I've been doing this job for 30 years, and I've interviewed umpteen people who are in open relationships, swingers relationships. I looked at the research, and they are probably some of the best couples because they have the best communication, and they are the couples who know how to separate. Not everybody can do this, but separate the sex from the love. So the primary relationship is full of love and lovemaking and tenderness and sex, but when they go outside of that, it's purely sex. You can't. And here's the challenge, is not getting emotionally attached to anybody you're having sex with.
But I wonder even with that, because it seems like there's an underlying assumption that we're having in this conversation, which is that sexuality and love are a zero-sum game. That you have a certain capacity, I have 100 sexuality points and 100 love points, and those 100 need to be given to my husband or my significant other. And if I start to engage in sexual activity or sexual thoughts towards other people, I am taking away from that 100. I'm taking away from, let's say, from my partner. Or if I start to engage, if I have a romantic interest or if I have an emotional attachment, God forbid I have an emotional attachment to someone that I'm having on the side, then I'm taking away the romantic attachment from my significant other.
That's true.
And I don't really know if that's totally the case, particularly when we get to sexuality, there is still a phenomenon that a lot of people, when they do take a step outside the marriage through infidelity or through a non-monogamous commitment, do bring a lot of that increased sexual energy back into their bedroom and back home. So it's not that they stay at a fixed sexuality level, it's they get hornier and they bring that back into their bedroom. And the other thing in terms of love is that in romantic love, it's one of the only places where we see it as the default assumption is that you can love one person. And if you love more than one person, then then you're taking away from somebody. But we don't see that with our kids. We don't see that with our family. I have 2 children, and I can say, I had 1 child before I had 2 children. And it's not that when I had a second child that all of a sudden my capacity for love just got taken away, that I had to split 50-50 my kid love in half. No, I love both of my children deeply and intensely. And I love my partner deeply and intensely, and I love my family deeply. And that capacity doesn't take away just by adding more people into the mix.
So when your boy toy invites you on a 2-week trip to Paris...
When my specific boy toy?
Yeah, your boy toy.
Right. Yeah, mine, yeah.
Yeah, yours, right? Invites you on a little jaunt to Paris for 2 weeks. Who's taking care of the children? The husband, the beleaguered husband at home?
But now you're getting into certain logistics of how things end up working out. And yes, I do have, if we're getting into my specific boy toy, I don't have a boy toy. Sorry, I don't have anything that exciting going on in my life. I wish I had something more interesting to contribute to you, the listener, but no boy toy taking me to Paris. But in that case, that's a different issue. That has to do with, I also couldn't just take off with my husband for 2 weeks to Paris and leave the kids alone in the basement.
Here's what I hear. Here's what I get in my practice. I get, because, there used to be a time where it was not a respectable thing to divorce when children were young. Now, the egg is barely seated in the womb and people are divorcing. So let me tell you what happens. The family is about to start, there's a child growing in the womb, or the family is starting and mom is busy breastfeeding a baby, or you have a couple of toddlers and you got to run around taking them to daycare and to well child appointments and mom and taught swimming lessons and so on, or you have elementary school kids with their 97 activities per week. I don't know how parents in this generation manage them. And the actual main couple are just too tired to have any communication or meaningful sex or anything. They go home, they go to sleep. One person, not exhausted by this model of too much work, because there's no way you can raise 2 children in today's society that's predicated on the 2 adults in the home raising the children without grandparents and aunts and uncles in the extended family. One parent separates himself or herself, and it can be mom and it can be dad. That I know from my divorce practice. And then strikes up a relationship with a friend with whom he or she plays tennis or a co-worker. And then you get this fantasy relationship going on where can have hot sex in the men's locker room at the local tennis club, and I don't have to think about my children and dirty diapers and the baby who's thrown up over the entire floor of her bedroom.
And frankly, I've had other people come into, I have couples, monogamous couples who come into my practice where one of them takes, when with the stress of child rearing and everything else, that one partner will check out in another non-sexual way, that they'll check out by dedicating too much time to work, check out by dedicating too much time to drinking or to their friends or to hobbies. There are all sorts of ways. Crappy parenting is an equal opportunity activity.
But I'm not talking
about
about
the parenting. I think it's the couplehood that gets
It's the
lost
couplehood.
in all of this.
There we agree. The
Yeah.
couplehood has to take second place, and that, frankly, I find is generally the hugely hard transition for most men, because they're no longer the center of their wife's attention, as is naturally the case. So I don't believe for a minute that for families where there's young children younger than high school age, that there's really time to engage in.
Well, you got to make it. I think that's part of it. You have to read. This is the effort.
For
this
the
is
extramarital
the
relationship?
No, for the marriage. Now,
my advice is that. My advice to the husbands and the wives both is go home and express your love and appreciation and respect for your partner, like the stay-at-home moms. I say, has it ever occurred to you to go home and say thank you to your husband, who has to work hard all day to bring, as they say, bring home the bacon so you can enjoy being able to stay at home and raise the babies, and vice versa, right? You laugh at that, but I'm talking about clients. I have other realities than ours.
I see that there was a consensus, and I'm sure that I know the data support this, that it's men that will be more inclined to stray when there's a child that's introduced into the family, the wife is less available. Same is true in bears, by the way. They will actually eat the children, tear the children apart if the bearess, I suppose, doesn't put out. But that's a side issue.
If she doesn't put out?
Yeah, if she's not.
Human men will tear apart these poor bear cubs if the bear isn't putting out. Wow.
That's a good one.
That's a good statistic.
Something worse. But no, the only point that I wanted to make here is that I don't want to be seen as too puritanical here, but I mean, there's an assumption here that sex is the ultimate expression or the necessary expression of intimacy between two partners. I have known couples, older couples and not so old couples, who have low sex drive but are more intimately connected than people who are having sex like bunny rabbits. And so I would say this to men out there, since I'm the only man at the table, I feel like I have to speak for my bros. And just say, there is a movement, this is for the millennials, the no fapping movement. Oh, yes. Yes. Laurie probably knows about this, being associated with Pornhub. But
why don't you describe what fapping means?
Well,
Dan?
fapping but for those who are, I guess, a little shocked virgin types, fapping is just a neologism. Well, not neologism, but just another word for masturbating. You could think of it, the sound
because
it
of
makes.
The sound it makes.
Fap. There you go.
Okay, Anne.
No, but the point is, and actually Dan Savage has also gone on about this. This is something where the neuronal pathways in the mind are reconnect, or there are burnt out pathways in the male mind for masturbating frequently and intensely over a lifetime, particularly among my generation, where porn is in your pocket, right, on your cell phone. And over time, they get hardwired. And then by the time you start making love to an actual partner that you might want to have in your life, you're not necessarily able to sexually connect in the same way because you've been desensitized by pornography.
But that's a big generalization to say that all men experience that.
I never said all men.
Right.
I agree.
But we have to be careful when we start to talk about masturbation, pornography, and all of that, because when you look at the numbers of users of pornography in the world, a small portion of those will have issues connecting or issues not being able to engage in other sexual activities, and also compulsive behavior. Not everybody uses pornography compulsively or masturbates compulsively. Right?
I totally agree with you, Laurie. Mind you, the very fact that there's a no fapping movement among the Reddit set, like the sort of male millennial set, shows that there's actually maybe this organic need right now that's growing up. They're starting to look at themselves and seeing that the ways that they're relating to sex and seeing that there's a problem.
Right.
And this is among men in basements on the internet, right? So for the fact that they have to put it out there in their own message boards shows you maybe how important this need is.
It is, but it's not pervasive. Like, it doesn't mean that it's an epidemic, as some people want to call, like, men and pornography and all of that. I get it. There is a problem for some men, and being locked away in your basement, fapping all day is a quite a problem, because you can't engage in other activities. I
don't think I'm ever going to go into another basement again after this conversation. I don't know what's going on down there, but it sounds horrible.
Let's get back to polyamory versus monogamy. So this came up a few minutes ago, Samantha. Can you be just as loving in either relationship? Or if you are polyamorous, does your attention and your caring sort of get divided between your partners?
I think that you can still have the same capacity for love, because I don't think that love is a finite resource. I think you can still love, several partners with similar intensity. But evidently, there's only so much time you have in a day, and only so much of you have in a day. So the more partners you're starting to mix in, particularly if you're not having kind of a single living space or situation, then it will start to take time away from the other partners that you have. And I think that where it ends up getting particularly complicated is when we get to mixing in children and we start getting into legal obligations. I think part of what's sort of coming out in our discussion is that, as best as I can summarize it, is that I think on the most part, we're pretty open to people making their own choices, and people in couples or thruples or whatever,
couples and triples,
that they have the right to consent to whatever relationship model works for them. But I think it does start to get much more complicated when you're mixing in. And I think that individually, if you're in a poly couple, then you can consent to having less individual time with any one of your partners. But it does get more complicated once you start mixing in children, and when you start mixing in the law and property rights and all that other fun and decidedly unsexy stuff.
There's a really great documentary that I saw years and years ago on two Montrealers who put it together called When Two Won't Do. And it was the woman was the polyamorous one, but the husband was not interested in polyamory, but he respected her desire to be polyamorous. And so they had the primary relationship, and she had a couple of boyfriends here and there. Mostly they lived out of town, and she would see them, weekends or what have you. It worked, and it was something that worked for them, and they went on to have children, and they had an amazingly open relationship in terms of communication that they were able to talk about. But that in that documentary was interesting because the other people she was engaged in or had a relationship with who were also poly, you got to see how their spouses reacted, and some weren't all that positive. So every couple has to kind of figure out, as you said, Samantha, that...
And I think an important part is that, and is recognizing more and more that we're recognizing, at least among millennials, that there's a spectrum, that it's not all or nothing. It's not monogamy versus non-monogamy. And even in the example that you're citing, I can see how, let's say if we're thinking in a family dynamic, if there's children involved, that it may be easier to accommodate the occasional tryst on a weekend here and there, or an occasional night out, rather than having where it leads to different issues or potentially different complications when you're getting much more, when you're getting into polyamory, when you're really getting into multiple loves kind of in a similar environment.
Yes. I just want to say something, looking to the millennials and looking at the survey data to say, things are changing, and it's so obvious to me that these are young people. They're not yet wise. I don't know why. I mean, there's no comparative studies that I have.
Aren't you a millennial?
Yeah, Daniel? I'm including myself in that cohort.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the opinions that I have about sexuality and union are a reflection of the experience I've had thus far as a young person. As I age and as I start to maybe have more of a wise mind, God willing, let's hope, your attitudes will naturally change. And I don't know if there's any real comparative studies that I've seen comparing sexual attitudes of, say, the millennials of yesteryear, young folk of yesteryear in terms of their sexual attitudes. And I think that this idea of the spectrum and things are changing, I think it's a little overstated. I think that there's nothing wrong. People live in the same city their whole lives. It happens. Nothing wrong with that. People have the same job their whole lives. It's nothing wrong with that. It happens all the time.
Much less today, though.
Less.
Less.
Sure, but it's not to say, I feel sometimes that having these avant-gardist type of discussions where we talk about the exceptional people that we know that it works for might send the wrong maybe encouragement or message to young people who don't necessarily have the wisdom or the resources to know what they're getting themselves into, and to think that this is where the trends are going and that they might end up getting hurt.
But as opposed to defaulting on monogamy where no one has ever gotten hurt ever?
And increasing infidelity. I mean, this is a way.
No. Hang on. There's no increasing infidelity. First of all, the heterosexual married relationships their success rate or their failure rate has not changed now in a number of years.
Right.
And however, if you want to compare them to same-sex relationships, then you get something interesting. So if you compare heterosexual married couples to heterosexual unmarried couples, the unmarried couples are somewhat more unstable, but similar. It's when you start comparing same-sex couples that you see the huge differences. Lesbian relationships, lesbian married couples are the most stable. And lesbian unmarried couples are more similar to lesbian married couples than anybody else. And then homosexual unmarried couples are the least stable, and near to them rank the homosexual married couples. So what does that teach us? It teaches us that the more men you have in a relationship, the less stable it is. And the more women you have in a relationship, the more stable it is. Okay. So I think that we have to take some instruction from economists that teach us that the single most important factor to determine our happiness, now that it's actually become a science, and that contribute the most to our longevity, are our long-term stable relationships. Which means, therefore, that marriage, whether it's with benefit of a ring on the finger or not, but what we know marriage is, which means with commitment and fidelity and intimacy and communication, is the single best predictor of happiness and health. And of course, the group in society that benefits the most from marriage are white men, which might discourage a lot of people, but it's true. Married men have the best improvement in terms of health and longevity and more so than married women, which tells me that a lot of married women are taking care of their husbands, right? So you millennials are very invested in saying everything's nuanced and is on a spectrum, and I think to myself, if I have a strep throat and that's what I'm diagnosed with, I'm going to take penicillin or ampicillin. I'm not going to take aspirin. Right? It is binary. Some things are binary. Some things are good for the human animal. Humans have been experimenting with all kinds of forms of unions. For instance, I've always wondered why we don't take some of the examples of antiquity, like line marriage, where you have like an originating husband and wife, and over years you add another husband, another wife, husband, wife, because that creates stability in ownership of assets, stability of revenue in the household, stability
except
for
then you're
children.
mixing in more men. So as you say,
that's true. But if it becomes a cultural norm, then that's the behavior that people favor. When you take away all cultural norms and say everything goes, for a lot of people you create a huge insecurity. And in fact, of course, you disregard the fact that marriage in and of itself is what civilizes men. That's what civilizes men.
Well, I agree, I think, with what you're saying. I think that...
That's unusual.
Well, no, I think security is the key word in all this when it comes to intimate unions. I don't know, I can't really speak for everybody, but I think anyone would agree that, well, really what you want is a sense of security as you define it. If to you security means I need to have certain sexual desires fulfilled that I'm not getting fulfilled here, and I want to negotiate with my partner so that there's a collective sense of security, that is good. That's wisdom to me. That's a good thing, and it'll have my blessing. But mind you, to your point, Mom, yes, men have testosterone. It's kind of what changes things. I mean, if you start pumping women through full of testosterone, there's plenty of research on this, nothing controversial, sexual appetite and desire will increase in that male way. I don't want to get into...
While good sense and wisdom disappear.
Which is to say, this is why, to your point, Mom, I think I'm agreeing, but I'm worried about agreeing with you, is that... Yes, I think men have far more to gain from marriage than a lot of them think. If men live longer, have greater health when they're married, and when they're not married, look, men get involved in violent interactions. They go to jail more. Men are dynamite when they're unbound by that union, which essentially just works against their trigger-happy, risk-taking testosterone. It's good for them.
And marriage isn't as good for women as it is for men.
Yes, and that's something I want.
Show that for
and
sure.
I want you to pick that up, hopefully, maybe on this podcast.
But unions without marriage are a catastrophe for women. You either
financially,
right. Let me tell you. Right.
So then, Dr. Laurie, if we agree that polyamorous relationships could sometimes be healthy, can we sort of take a step back and not judge polygamous relationships and maybe explain the difference between the two?
Well, I don't know all that much about polygamous cultures or societies. They seem to, like I think Anne France, you said it, when it's the cultural norm, it works when it's the norm, when everybody's doing it, when everybody seems to be kind of engaged in that and have the same beliefs, it seems to work. We're a culture of monogamy, North America, but there's plenty of other places that don't value monogamy, or at least not the way that we see it, the constructs of different relationships. So, I'm sure that polygamous societies have their own issues. There's a resource, the resources, as you wwere talking about, Samantha, is that you don't have that much time, right? If you have one husband and 5 wives, you get sex Mondays, maybe, and then the other one Tuesdays. If that's the resource,
assuming they're heterosexual.
Assuming they're heterosexual. I mean, there's all kinds of things, right? That you're having kids with all these parents, and I mean, there's complications that are inevitable, I would think, in polygamous societies too.
Well, here are the facts on the ground. First of all, polygamy is the generic term that covers all polyamorous situations: one man, many women; one woman, many men.
But that's marriage, because polyamory doesn't
necessarily mean marriage,
right?
Doesn't, because we don't permit
That's
plural
right.
marriage, right? But we're talking here about polygynous relationships where there are many women. A polyandrous relationship doesn't bother me because women aren't being oppressed. If one woman is being taken care of by 2 guys, that probably half satisfies her. So that's pretty good. But in the other relationships, I followed very closely the evolution of the jurisprudence out in BC, where they actually practice polygyny out in Bountiful, BC. These Mormon-based faiths where men marry multiple women. And here are the facts on the ground. These girls are promised off at 12, 13, 14 years of age, and that's when they are having sex and are being required to marry. Consent is very, very questionable. They're educated in the compound, so they're not getting an education about their rights and their freedoms. They immediately go on welfare. They have multiple children with the fellow, and all those children are receiving welfare benefits. And I have to tell you, I challenge a man in modernity to have the means, even to have 2 wives and 2 children each, to make each wife happy, and you have 4 kids. In today's world, I don't have to tell you, things have changed from when I started out in life. Well, even before. By the time I started out in life, it was already becoming a requirement in big cities that you had to be 2-income families to manage. Now it's a sine qua non of modernity. So I also laugh how many men would really want to have 2 wives under the same roof.
I'd love to have a wife. Thank you very much. But,
that's something different.
We've said that many, all my friends, it's like, wouldn't it be nice to have a wife just to help us do the things we do?
That's right. And that's many of us who have a husband who say, wouldn't we
That's what
love
I'm saying.
to have a wife?
Yeah.
Just so. That was very much the complaint of our generation. So it is therefore, to my mind, in every manifestation I've seen of it, oppressive to women. And depending on the culture, that people grow up in, if you look into other cultures and other parts of the world, the wife, the older wife, doesn't even get to have a say as to who the fellow chooses as wife number 2 or 3 or 4.
Well, but I think yes, in terms of those traditional societies where polygamy is still practiced in that way, there's some of these communities can have really, really deleterious and harmful effects for the women and the girls involved. But I wonder if we can really say that is one man, many women, that's absolutely the problem in and of itself, or if it's rather any sort of traditional patriarchal relationship arrangement, because there's plenty still monogamous commitments or plenty of single man-woman marriages where there's still, in certain societies, where there still are child brides, where there still are men who aren't providing for their wives, who are still don't take them into consideration or still violent with them, that can still be really harmful for the female partner involved. And so I think it may be, to use the term, it may be the issue may be more traditional patriarchy rather than
Also, wait. So to back up, Samantha, another thing that you mentioned is that, to have the means to be able to provide for all these children. I mean, there's a reason these unions, at least in the Americas, occur in very rural communities. You don't necessarily have the same cost of living. You could have a self-sustaining sort of kibbutz type of community where the costs aren't an issue. But as to the inherent problems of polygamy, you will see greater crime statistics because the younger men have less access to women, and so there's not as much of a stabilizing force. The high status men essentially hog all the women, and the younger men are often pushed out of the communities because they're female
competitors.
Yes, that's right. And so these young driftless or drifting men are become real social problems.
But in fact, you see something similar. You've seen some similar rises in China with the one-child policy, where when you have, where in terms of that, it had to do with a lot of people selectively aborting or killing off female infants to have male infants. So you ended up having a population differential where there's more men than women in the society, and you end up seeing a similar increase in crime. That if heterosexual men don't have ready access to mates, then they're up to no good.
And not just crime, but also there's geopolitical concerns as well. They also say, they've done research on this, that it usually comes before a great war because you have all these surplus of angry young men. So there's serious problems with this, I think, in grand social constructs.
But I come back to marriage has a civilizing effect on men. And if we believe every man has a right to be able to marry and in the exercise of his freedom and found a family, then you can't tolerate societies that favor polygamous relationships and that disturb the balance of the one-man-woman relationship. Although that's secondary for me. The primary issue remains is that the opportunity for the oppression of women is far too great in polygynous societies. I see plenty of oppression of women in plain old marriages that I wouldn't want to encourage it in plural marriage. And in addition, we still have a social catastrophe across the continent in many from different cultures and different communities of men who walk out of their marriages, and it's socially tolerated. It's socially tolerated now in the way it was unimaginable even 25 years ago that a woman could be a young woman married and pregnant, and the man would just take off and he's shacked up with somebody else, and who cares, and has to pay $3 of child support and go find him to be able to collect that child support. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And if you wonder why there's such a huge drop-off in the birth rate in the Occidental world, that's a huge contributor. Because your average woman wakes up in the morning and thinks in her ambitions for her life, in her dreams and aspirations, she's only going to have as many children as she feels she can support on her own with her career. And for most women, that number is 0 or 1. And that's why you have, particularly in a province like Quebec, such a low birth rate.
Let's end with this question. We've been talking a lot about sort of polyamory versus monogamy. What can monogamists learn from polyamorous? Is there anything that they can learn to sort of expand their horizons or their definition of love and to love more effectively, perhaps?
I think, Laura, you're in the best position to answer this, but I'm going to give a stab at it first. I think that one of the things that tends to be really valued in poly communities and frankly in kink communities is a lot of upfront open communication and not taking certain rules as defaults, but really having real direct and open communication, what people are comfortable with, what they want, and not just as a one-off conversation. Okay, we're non-monogamous. All right, thanks. That was a great conversation. Now that's it. But to be able to keep coming back to those conversations and renegotiating and reprocessing things. And I think that is a fantastic model to be able to, for traditionally monogamous couples to be able to aspire to or adopt, whether they choose to, even if they choose to continue to be monogamous, that's fine. Everyone's choice, that's theirs. But to be able to not take certain things for granted and have that open communication ongoing through the relationship.
You're absolutely right. I think one of the issues that I see a lot is that couples have a really hard time just talking about sex in general. They are okay doing it, but they won't talk about it. And this, over years of pent-up frustration and resentments and all of this stuff is not healthy for a relationship. So that's been my experience, is that people, generally speaking, are not that comfortable talking about their sexuality. They're not comfortable talking about their needs, maybe women more so, that they maybe not even aware of what their needs are or have trouble with their own experimentation of their own bodies and saying it out loud because, they may have grown up in a time when you didn't speak of such things and nice girls didn't talk about how much they loved sex and things like that. So there's all kinds of messages that are still there that we still grow up with that are harmful to our sexuality, but nobody talks about it. We have a hard time. So those couples, the poly couples, can certainly teach us, and anybody in open marriages. You can't have an open relationship unless you have great communication. Otherwise, it's a failed relationship. End of story. It will fall apart.
And I think, and if you notice, the two psychologists, the take-home point is use your words.
Use your words.
Use your words.
Yeah. Lots of
Use your
words.
all the words.
Just if I could take a stab at answering the question, I think that yes, conversation, communication. My hope is that in my unions that the conversations happen so early on that polyamory never becomes a topic to be discussed. My understanding is that polyamory sort of presents itself, and this is from some of the research I've done, I don't pretend to be an expert, presents itself when there's a real problem in the relationship.
No. That's when it's a prelude to the relationship dissolving. No. You can't have, in order to be, and if we're going to go with psychobabble, let's use some psychobabble. Let's throw some psychobabble out at them. If you're looking at people that have a secure attachment relationship with the person that they're with, the more secure they are, the more they can use the person that they're with as a safe base from which to explore the world. Because they know if they go out and they explore other things and they get hurt, they know that they can come back to that safe person and get help and renegotiate things.
And you don't fix a relationship by being polyamorous.
No,
That's
you end a relationship
right.
by, if a relationship is deeply conflictual and then you decide to go for polyamory, I would say that on the most part, that ends up being a step out the door.
Then explain it to me, doctors. What is the impetus? What's the desire when you're in a healthy, happy relationship to want to have sex with other people? What's the desire?
Where is there not the desire? I think monogamy. Who said monogamy is easy?
It's the hardest thing, actually.
Well, that's exactly. So you just walked into what I was trying to say. Is that everything in life that takes a lot of work is usually worthwhile. I mean, whether it's your career or your job or your family or your kids.
If that's what you're geared for, there are people who will tell you, "I am not monogamous. I cannot be. I don't want to
be." No, and that's okay. So, but when you say because monogamy is hard,
grow old alone.
No, but
not necessarily.
I take your point, Laurie, and that's fine if you have a different inclination. But to say, monogamy is hard, therefore,
it's not. We're not hard, therefore.
Okay.
It's not hard, therefore. You're saying why? Your question directly was why would anyone, if they're satisfied in their current sexual relationship, why would they even have an interest in having a sexual relationship with anyone else?
I didn't get an answer. I heard because it's hard. Because it's hard.
For variety, for different reasons. They may as a couple enjoy variety, do not see themselves being with the same person and having sex with the same person for the next 40 years. And it's something that they agree to. It doesn't harm their relationship. They're just doing it for sexual variety, like including sex toys or doing whatever else it might be. And that's their choice.
Yeah, but I see it. I know the metaphor might have its limits, but I think in terms of like a job, let's say you have a benevolent boss, an employer that is open to all negotiations and changing every single detail of your job. So in a real-time, ongoing, daily basis, and it's healthy employer-employee relationship, you can negotiate your terms of what you like. And so ideally, you should never really have a need to want to get out of the relationship or with your employer.
It's a strange analogy to use, given that a boss usually has multiple employees. So
what model are you going with here? Let's say your business partner. I think that's obviously more on brand here.
I don't see why there would be the default assumption that, I think the default assumption that if you're in a monogamous relationship and if you're sexually satisfied and emotionally fulfilled, then you will never look elsewhere ever. And I think that type of attitude can be really harmful in monogamous relationships. And if you want to maintain a monogamous relationship, I think it behooves you to recognize that there's going to be times for different situations and different reasons and different stressors and different experiences. I said stressors is one of many different reasons that you may. People aren't static. You're not the same person. I'm not the same person I was at 20.
Right? There can be temptations. It's what you do about it. Monogamy is a choice. I come back to what I said at the beginning.
I so love being older. I see a tall, cool drink of water. Then I go through my mind all the awesome things I could do.
And then you take a nap.
And then I take a nap. I love it. I'm done. I don't need it. I won't do it. I won't compromise my relationship. I just tell you, children, one day you're going to be old like me and you're going to recognize that old promise that it doesn't matter who you're playing with at lunchtime as long as you come home for supper is absolute nonsense. Commitment and fidelity are worth it. And the security and strength and awesomeness of having a partner who's a witness to your life, you're a witness to his life.
You can still have that in a poly relationship, and an open marriage, and a swinging relationship. You can still have that.
The only nuance you put there is that's where two people are playing around together. Well, at the same time. in the same place.
That's their rules, but there are others who have different rules.
Although it's interesting, just as a one note that I'm just going to throw in here is we keep again throwing around the term monogamy, and I was saying before it's difficult to define, and even the definition of this ideal monogamy has changed dramatically over time. It used to be one person for life. That was monogamy. Now it's one person at a time. So even as you're talking about now, about how, Mom, how wonderful monogamy is and everything, you certainly have not been with one person in your life. That's it. For life. No. Now you're talking about the one at a time.
Serial monogamy.
Sure.
That's a little bit different.
Well,
so
we all
now
like
if
cereal.
you look at research...
it's raisin bran monogamy. What do you want me to tell you?
You caught her.
There we go.
So, final thought then, do we all agree that monogamy perhaps is the default position, is best for most people, but in certain circumstances, polyamory can also work as a relationship?
Yes.
I'd say that was a good summary to that. I think it's a choice we make, and it's a social construct. It's there for a reason. I think, Anne France, you brought up some really good points as to why it works, the security and all of that for families. So it works if that's what you want, if that's the choice that you make. Is it easy to be in a faithful, forever monogamous relationship? I'd say no. The majority of couples, unfortunately, experience infidelity. So if there's a way to eliminate infidelity somehow, and if those are the couples that might want to rethink the rules of their engagement, then we need to have more conversations about what people want.
I would like to think that people should indeed start and explore those questions first. Of course, there's so many questions to explore: management of money and how to raise children.
Before marriage.
Before marriage.
Yes.
Before,
Totally
people
agree.
start cohabiting too quickly and then face the difficulties that are unanticipated that they didn't discuss. So I wouldn't necessarily say monogamy has to be the default position. I think it should be discussed openly. People should be thinking right away about their differences in drive and expectation and how much and how often and how long.
But that changes. Let's remember that.
And that changes
there's
too.
There's a reality that will change a lot
especially
over the course of a life.
Especially with the arrival of children, needless to say, with illness later in life. And I think those discussions are important. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is never do anything that is in a context of deceit, ever. The harm that you can cause to your partner for the 5 minutes of pleasure that you had in some casual something is something that will haunt you your entire life. Yeah. And I've had clients who carry a big burden of guilt because they had a mistake, they had an accident. It's not that I judge them or view it so terrible what they did, but the harm they caused their partner can have repercussions for many years.
Yes.
And those repercussions can also be expressed through the children. And then the third thing I would say is, and this is, I suppose, to the partner that might find him or herself cheated upon, is if there has been an accident, the first thought should not be to go see your divorce lawyer. Your first thought should be forgiveness. And I have no words to explain enough how rotten it is for people who go through a divorce, how miserable it is, not just because you're dealing with lawyers and it's economically difficult, but it's hugely destructive. You're tearing into the fabric of the narration of your own life. And we attach way too much importance to our kibbles and bits and the moments we spend here and there. It's not that important, I think. And I think forgiveness is important. It's a great Christian value that's promoted here by the Jew. And I can't emphasize enough that going to see your divorce lawyer should be your last choice.
Agreed.
Not your first. Your last choice.
And I have a lot of respect for lawyers who send their clients to see the counselor first before they end up there. And I get a lot of referrals from lawyers who say, you know what? Because people go to the lawyer in the heat of the moment. You cheated, that's it, I'm getting divorced, I call the lawyer. Like everything happens so fast that they don't have time to process a lot of that and what is it that they're actually giving up to and how much you can work on it. I've worked with so many couples and they have thrived, survived, more than survived, and have built strong relationships.
I think there's a good line for that. It's called "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Yeah. I think it sounds biblical, eh?
Or turn the other cheek, which sounds a little sexy in this context.
Which cheek?
Dr. Laurie, where can we listen to you, read you, watch you, discover your work?
So lots of ways. You can hear podcasts of my show Passion, which is a nightly show about sex, love, and relationships on iHeartRadio or on my website, drlaurie.com. I've also done 2 TED Talks on long-term relationships. So a lot of what we've talked about today. So and on pleasure, sexual pleasure as well. I can be found also at the Pornhub Sexual Wellness Center, which is a new website on the Pornhub website, which offers sexual health education to viewers who are already there. So lots of ways.
We'll link up to your 2 TED Talks at the goldwaters.ca and to Pornhub too, maybe, Goldwaters? I don't know. Do we?
Pornhub, that sounds good.
Join us next time for another episode of The Goldwaters. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, #The Goldwaters, and subscribe on iTunes, don't forget. You can also find us on SoundCloud as well. I'm Dan Delmar, your moderator. Thank you, Goldwaters, and thank you, Dr. Laurie.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks. It was fantastic having you here, Laurie. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It was good fun.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Laurie. It was great.
Thanks for coming, no pun intended.
Provocateur.media